At 2:13 on a moonless night in October 1944, in the black waters off the Philippines, a thin-hulled American patrol torpedo boat clawed its way through wine-chopped seas at over 30 knots, its wooden frame shuddering with every wave. On the open aft deck, a 24-year-old motor machinist's mate and deck gunner, Petty Officer Second Class Danny Mercer from Astoria, Oregon, gripped the hand wheels of a 20mm Oerlikon cannon that should have been their last line of defense, knowing it was half broken and liable to jam at the worst possible moment. Ahead of him, somewhere beyond the curtains of rain and spray, moved a Japanese coastal convoy, small freighters, barges and patrol craft creeping along the archipelago's shadowed shoreline to feed the Imperial Army's crumbling defenses, while behind him, in every vibration of the PT boat's Packard engines, he could feel the contempt of staff officers who had quietly dubbed their mission already dead. Danny Mercer had grown up on the Columbia River, the son and grandson of fishermen, learning early how a boat spoke through its vibrations, how a hull sounded when it was right and when something inside it was on the verge of tearing loose. Before the war he had been a dockyard mechanic, the kind of young man who could strip and rebuild an engine with little more than a wrench, a flat screwdriver and a length of baling wire, but who had never been farther from home than Seattle. When the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor hit the radio, he enlisted in the Navy hoping to serve on a big ship, something with armor and weight, but instead found himself assigned to motor torpedo boat training, condemned as some saw it to a plywood coffin that could be torn apart by a single shell from a destroyer. His record showed 12 night patrols completed, 1 confirmed barge kill, 1 probable, and 1 mission where mechanical failure had forced his boat to limp home at idle speed, earning him a reputation as the man who could make broken machinery run, but also a knowing belief that machinery always failed at the worst possible time. He stood to lose more than his own life on that black October night. There was Maria back home, the dark-haired shipyard drafter who had made him promise in a hurried letter that he would come back with all your pieces still attached. And there was his kid brother, Tommy, now a rifleman somewhere on Luzon, whose last note had been a shaky pencil line ending with "Don't let them sink you before I get home." On this patrol, he also stood to lose the men who trusted him. The skipper, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alan Pierce, a thin, serious New Englander dragged from Harvard to the Solomons and now on his 20th patrol. Chief Motor Machinist Red Laurie, who treated the 3 roaring Packard V12 engines below deck like temperamental racehorses, and the other 6 crewmen who lived on cigarettes, coffee and the belief that speed might be enough to cheat death. The immediate mission seemed simple on paper: slip north along the Philippine coast, intercept a Japanese supply run threading its way between the islands, and sink anything with a rising sun flag before it could offload troops or cargo. Strategically, it was part of a much larger push, the American return to the Philippines, intended to starve Japanese garrisons before they could mount coordinated resistance and to cut the flow of reinforcements to the front lines where soldiers like Tommy were already in the field. But tactically, tonight's run had been branded suicidal even before the PT crews had cast off their lines. Intelligence suspected at least 3 escort vessels with heavier guns than anything Danny's boat carried, plus shore batteries and the ever-present threat of Japanese spotter planes that could drop flares and turn the Black Sea into a killing ground. Danny's internal conflict was a knot in his chest that tightened with each mile they raced into enemy territory. He believed in the mission. Every freighter that failed to reach its destination meant fewer bullets aimed at his brother, but he also knew how thin their margin of survival really was, especially with his gun mount half crippled. Earlier that afternoon, while the tropical sun still beat down on the PT base's oil-stained dock, he had stripped the Oerlikon down to its frame, trying to fix a hairline crack in the feed mechanism and a stubborn tendency to misfeed shells, only to be told by the squadron armorer that replacement parts were weeks away. He had improvised, fashioning a tiny shim from a scrap of brass and binding the cracked casing with wire and canvas tape, a field repair that might hold for a few bursts or might blow apart under sustained fire, turning the weapon into a useless iron sculpture at the moment they needed it most. As their PT boat advanced, it was one of 3 craft fanning out into the darkness, a little mosquito fleet tasked with doing the job of cruisers and destroyers in waters too cluttered and shallow for larger ships. They were fast, able to reach 40 knots in a sprint, but they were fragile, essentially wooden speedboats with gasoline tanks and torpedoes lashed to their sides, the naval equivalent of lighting matches in a dynamite shed. Their main punch was 4 torpedoes slung in tubes along the deck, meant to cripple larger ships, but most of their combat experience in recent months had been against small barges, coastal freighters, and patrol boats. targets that were often too small to justify valuable torpedoes and had to be fought with machine guns and cannons instead. This mismatch between weapon and target had shaped their tactics and their nerves. Where training films imagined clean torpedo runs against big warships, the reality was messy close-quarters fighting, short-range gunnery duels, and sudden ambushes around jungle-lined headlands where the enemy might be hiding behind a blacked-out shoreline. It was precisely in these chaotic scraps that Danny's deck gun mattered more than any torpedo. Yet it was precisely that gun which now sat under his hands with a patched-up feed and a cracked recoil spring that might seize solid during a long burst. Every time he tested the traverse, listening to the metal whisper and grind, he heard his own private clock ticking toward a moment when everything would depend on whether his makeshift fix held together. Earlier in the day, at the briefing hut, the squadron commander had traced the convoy's probable route on a stained map tacked to the wall. A line of pencil passing between names that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't grown up in the islands. Narrow straits, reef-choked channels, and coastal inlets where sandbars and uncharted rocks waited to gut any boat that wandered off the invisible safe lanes. Intelligence reports, some from code breakers, some from guerrillas and coast watchers hidden in the jungle, had warned of heavy Japanese traffic moving under cover of bad weather, trying to slip men and supplies past the tightening American net. The mission order was blunt: intercept, harass, and destroy. Prioritize transports over escorts. Avoid unnecessary engagement with major warships. And above all, deny the enemy the chance to reinforce his crumbling positions inland. Yet beneath the official language lingered rumor and resentment. Among the crews, whispers had spread that higher command considered this particular patrol expendable, a probe into an especially dangerous channel where they expected heavy opposition but had no better assets to risk. The nickname "already dead" had started as a bitter joke in the mess line when one radioman heard a staff officer say something about writing off a few plywood coffins to see how strong their defenses really are. But like all dark humor, it stuck because it felt too true to ignore. Danny had laughed along when someone scratched the words on a bulkhead in grease pencil, yet now, out on the black water with the engines drumming and the boat throwing spray in his face, the phrase repeated in his head like a curse. Pierce, their lieutenant, tried to cut through the fatalism with quiet professionalism. He had already survived engagements in the Solomons, seen PT boats shredded by shells that turned wood and men into splinters, and he carried his experience like a hard shell that nothing seemed to pierce. That night he stood in the open cockpit, binoculars pressed to his eyes, calling range and bearing updates in a low, even voice, unaffected by the wind or the possibility that any shadow on the horizon might be a destroyer that could erase them with a single salvo. But even he had been unusually tense during the briefing, frowning when the chart showed how far from supporting forces they would be and how vague the intelligence was about the exact number of enemy escorts. The tactical plan hinged on surprise and coordination. The 3 PT boats would run in parallel, separated by enough distance to avoid all being caught in one sweep of enemy fire but close enough to mutually support each other if a firefight broke out. They would use the darkness and rain to get into position ahead of the convoy's projected path, then idle their engines and wait like ambush predators, launching torpedoes at the transports first before turning their guns on whatever survived. At least, that was the theory. In practice, night operations were chaotic, radios crackled with half-heard instructions, and radar, primitive and temperamental on small craft, could fail at critical moments, forcing crews to rely on eyesight and intuition in a world where one mistaken silhouette could mean the difference between sinking an enemy ship and accidentally crossing the bow of a friendly. It was the radar that first picked up the convoy's presence, a faint cluster of ticks blooming on a cramped green screen in the wheelhouse, somewhere beyond the curtain of rain. The radar operator called out bearing and approximate range, his voice tight but steady, and Pierce adjusted course, ordering reduced throttles to avoid throwing up a phosphorescent wake that might give them away. The sea seemed to grow even darker as they slowed, the world shrinking to the patch of storm-torn water immediately around their hull and the faint shine of spray whipping past the bow. Inside Danny's head, the chain of problems lengthened. It was one thing to patch a gun in daylight at the dock, another to trust that patch with lives when the moment came to open fire. If the gun failed early, they would be nearly defenseless at close range. If it failed late, with the barrel glowing and the mount already under strain from recoil, there was a chance something might shear away and injure or kill him, or tear loose and twist the gun out of alignment for good. Worse, the ammunition load for the night was limited. Hundreds of rounds seemed like a lot, until one realized how quickly a fully automatic cannon could devour belts under the pressure of combat, especially when firing at multiple targets in quick succession. His internal conflict sharpened when he imagined not just dying, but failing to stop an enemy boat from raking his friends with machine gun fire, failing to hit a barge that might be packed with soldiers headed toward his brother's front, or failing to live up to the promise he had written to Maria that he would do something worthy before coming home. Courage for him was not the absence of fear but the decision to hold onto his weapon and his job even when he felt that fear pressing in on all sides. To accept that tonight, courage might mean firing a broken gun until it broke completely. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the war would care either way. Whether a single patrol, a single fight, a handful of boats in the dark could truly change the course of a campaign spread across thousands of miles of ocean. The first visual contact came as a smear of darker darkness against the horizon, a shape too straight and consistent to be cloud or island. As the PT boat eased closer, the shapes multiplied, dim, hulking outlines of transports or freighters, wagons of the sea moving in tight formation, screened by smaller escorts that kept to the convoy's flanks like wolves guarding a herd. For a moment, the sheer size of the target set gave Danny a flicker of hope. Hitting something in that mass would be easier than hunting a single ship, and if they could strike hard and fast, perhaps they could break the formation and so panic before the enemy's gunners had time to react. Then he saw the nearest escort. It rode lower and sleeker than the transports, bristling with what looked like twin-mounted guns along its deck, and even at a distance its silhouette radiated menace. A detailed intelligence sketch flashed in his memory. Japanese subchaser class, lightly armored but armed with rapid-fire weapons and depth charges that could shred a wooden boat or collapse its hull with a near miss. Against that, his PT boat carried nothing like armor. Its survival would depend entirely on velocity, maneuvering and the ability to inflict enough damage, quickly enough, to force the escort to break off or die. Pierce whispered with the other skippers over the radio, voice low and focused. The plan shifted in seconds. One PT boat would swing wide to attack from the far side, drawing the escort's attention and, if lucky, luring them into firing in the wrong direction. Another would stay back, ready to dart in and launch torpedoes at any large ships that tried to break away. Their own boat would close on the convoy's nearer flank, using its guns to hit smaller enemy craft and to create enough confusion that the larger targets lost cohesion. It meant they would be the point of the spear, the first into the hornet's nest, and Danny's gun would be the knife edge of that thrust. Inside the hull, Red throttled back a fraction more, coaxing the Packard engines to a lower growl that made them less visible and slightly less vulnerable to mechanical failure during sudden acceleration. These engines were masterpieces of power and fragility, high-performance racing motors adapted for war, capable of propelling the PT boat at astonishing speeds but demanding constant care, constant feeding of fuel, constant nursing of temperatures that could spike and seize pistons solid without warning. Any hiccup now, any fuel contamination, any overlooked hairline crack could leave them limping in front of an enemy convoy with no armor to protect them. Danny checked his jury-rig feed one last time, thumbs brushing the tape and wire he had wrapped around the cracked casing, silently begging it to hold. He had adjusted his firing stance, bracing his legs wider than usual to compensate for the gun's slightly erratic recoil pattern since the crack had appeared, knowing that the more control he could keep over the weapon, the fewer violent jolts it would suffer. He had also rearranged spare ammunition drums, trying to ensure the smoothest possible changeovers under fire, cutting down any extra motion that might jar the mechanism and expose its weakness. When the first searchlight beam sliced across the water from the enemy escort, the night shattered. A white spear of light burned through the rain, overshot them, then swung back, probing the darkness like a living thing searching for prey. In that instant, Pierce made his call. No more stealth. Engines to full. Attack now. The boat leapt forward as Red fed power to the engines and Danny's world narrowed to the arc of his gun, the course of the approaching escort, and the knowledge that in seconds, tracer rounds would fill the air between them. The opening exchange was a blur of light and motion. Danny fired first, thumb depressing the trigger paddle as he swung the Oerlikon toward the glaring searchlight, sending a stream of glowing tracer rounds into its blinding heart. The patch feed coughed, hesitated, then fed again, the weapon shuddering but continuing to cycle, each shell hammering out and disappearing into the night. The enemy's answer came a heartbeat later, greenish tracers, whipping toward them, some passing overhead with a harsh buzzing whine, others smashing into the water close enough to send up columns of spray that hit like fistfuls of wet gravel. He saw the searchlight flicker, then vanish as one of his shells finally found its mark, turning the escort's eye into a burst of sparks and smoke, plunging that part of the sea back into darkness. But that small victory immediately created a new problem. Now both sides were firing in darkness again, and without the searchlight's glare to blind them, the enemy gunners could follow the PT boat's muzzle flashes and engine. Danny felt, rather than saw, the escort turning to bring more guns to bear, and Pierce swung the PT boat into a hard, skidding turn, trying to spoil the enemy's aim while lining up their own torpedoes for a shot at one of the transports behind. Below deck, Red's engines howled as the sudden maneuver overloaded their bearings, pushing the PT boat nearly to its limits. Wooden planks groaned under the strain, and a spray of cold water drenched Danny as the boat's side dug into a wave, briefly exposing the deck to the sea. His patch gun was now not only under fire but also being battered by the boat's violent move, every lurch a test of his improvised fix. For a terrifying second, the feed jammed, the gun's steady roar breaking into a choking stagger that sent his heart into his throat. He reacted without conscious thought, slapping the drum, working the charging handle, feeling the rough edges of the brass shim under his fingers. A shell casing clinked against his boot and vanished overboard, but the weapon cleared, the bolt slid home, and the Oerlikon resumed its harsh, stuttering song. The moment of silence, however brief, had consequences. In that gap, enemy fire bracketed the splinters flying from the deck as bullets tore through it instead of flesh only because the angle had been just off. Danny registered the near miss the way a man notices a knife grazing his coat. The real cut had not yet come, but its possibility was suddenly, painfully clear. Pierce shouted back a reminder, "Conserve ammunition. There would likely be more than one enemy craft to face before the night was over." That was the second edge of their tactical problem each time they solved the immediate crisis, another loom. They needed to blind the escort, protect themselves and their torpedo-firing run, yet every long burst they fired ate into the ammunition Danny might need later if smaller craft or low-flying planes joined the fray. The mission's bigger objective to break the convoy and deny the Japanese army its supplies demanded endurance as much as aggression. As they roared in, one of the other PT boats surged up on the convoy's far side, silhouetted briefly by muzzle flashes as its crew also opened fire. In that flicker of light, Danny saw at least 3 Japanese vessels pivoting, forming a loose screen in front of the larger transports. They moved with the grim discipline of men who had drilled for precisely this kind of attack. The convoy's operational importance had clearly been understood by the Japanese command, and the escorts were determined not to let wooden raiders derail the supply run. Every shell that flew now tied into a broader campaign. Supplies that made it through this gauntlet might bolster resistance inland, lengthen the war, cost more lives on beaches and in jungles beyond sight of this. Then came the first decisive moment, the kind of snapshot decision that would echo through Danny's memory long after the war. One of the smaller Japanese escorts, a fast patrol craft closer in size to the PT boat than to a destroyer, broke from its station and charged directly toward them, bow wave foaming, bow gun barking rapid fire. It was closing at an angle that threatened to cut across their path just as Pierce needed to steady the PT boat for a torpedo salvo at the transports behind, a move that placed tactical success at odds with immediate survival. Pierce could have turned away, evading the smaller craft and preserving his boat, at the cost of losing their window for torpedo launch. That would have spared his crew the worst of the patrol boat's fire but left the larger Japanese transport column intact and unmolested, free to continue toward the front lines. Instead, he chose the razor's edge. He ordered Red to hold course and speed, keeping them on an intercept path that maximized their torpedo firing angle while trusting Danny and the broken Oerlikon to suppress or disable the charging patrol craft enough to keep it from tearing them apart. Danny's internal conflict erupted into a physical sensation, his stomach dropping as if he had stepped off a cliff. He knew what Pierce was asking: use the damaged weapon to punch a hole through an oncoming enemy at close range, absorb the storm of bullets long enough for the torpedoes to do their work, and only then worrying about whether the gun still functioned for whatever came next. This was the impossible decision he had feared, not in the abstract but in the shape of a real enemy boat now, bearing down on them with muzzle flashes winking like angry eyes. In that moment he realized that all his promises, his brother, to Maria, to himself, would be fulfilled or broken in the next few minutes of continuous fire. He lowered his cheek to the sights, ignoring the sting of salt and wind, and timed his bursts as carefully as he could. Shorter, controlled strings of fire would reduce stress on the cracked casing and feed, but longer bursts would increase their chances of hitting the small, bucking outline of the enemy patrol craft in the heaving sea. He compromised longer than doctrine recommended, shorter than panic would have demanded. Dan watched as his tracers stitched across the water, climbing toward the patrol craft's bow, bridge, and gun mount. One burst chewed into the area around the enemy's forward gun. In another, he saw sparks and a sudden drop in that weapon's rate of fire, suggesting that either the gun or its crew had been hit. For a brief, dizzying moment, the tactical balance tilted in their favor. The Japanese patrol craft wobbled, its fire slackening, even as Pierce called out final corrections for the torpedo launch. Two of their torpedoes hissed away from the PT boat's tubes, their wakes briefly visible as pale streaks in the dark sea before vanishing into the chaos around the convoy. Danny barely registered their departure. His world remained locked on the patrol craft, which was still coming, still a threat even if wounded. Behind that immediate duel, however, the strategic picture rippled. If those torpedoes hit, if the transports died in the night, entire companies of Japanese soldiers might never reach the front, artillery pieces might never roll off decks, crates of ammunition might never be stacked near guns aimed at American troops. If they missed, then tonight's bravery, tonight's risks, might amount to nothing more than a footnote in some after-action report, another example of courage expended to no effect. Danny understood that the war's scale dwarfed his individual action, yet he also knew that wars were built from nights like this, from men on small boats making impossible choices in the dark. Seconds stretched into lifetimes as he tracked the patrol craft. The patch gun stuttered once, twice, but did not fail. Each time the feed hesitated, he adjusted pressure, coaxing it back into operation with the delicate touch of a man who had lived his whole life listening to machines. Splinters flew from the PT boat's deck where enemy rounds found wood instead of flesh. One crewman went down with a shout, clutching a bloody arm, and another immediately took his place at a nearby 50 caliber mount, refusing to let the volume of fire drop for even a heartbeat. Danny felt each new wound, each scream, as an accusation, and a spur every hit they took before he could silence that enemy gun was another reminder of the weight on his shoulders. He finally saw the moment when his fire truly bit deep. A burst slammed into the patrol craft just abaft its bridge, the tracers disappearing into something vital, and a heartbeat later a small bloom of fire licked up from that spot. The enemy boat's course faltered, its bow swinging offline as if the helmsman had lost control or been killed. It did not explode in some dramatic fireball. Instead, it seemed to sag, its forward motion bleeding away as smoke drifted from its wounded midsection. But even as that immediate threat lessened, a fresh problem presented itself. The PT boat was now charging into a space where at least two more enemy craft were turning, and the torpedoes they had launched were racing toward the heart of the convoy. The first explosion came then, a deep, chest-punching roar that seemed to rise from beneath the sea itself. A column of water and debris leapt into the air behind the escort screen, silhouetting the outline of a transport in the moment it began to tear itself apart. Danny felt, rather than saw, the ship's back break, heard the distant, ragged chorus of secondary detonations as fuel and cargo caught fire. One torpedo had found its mark. A second detonation followed half a minute later, farther back in the column, where a smaller freighter staggered and veered out of line, its bow settling as fires blossomed along its deck. He saw that second ship clearly in a flash of orange, a coastal freighter, smaller than the first transport, but still stuffed with crates that now turned into jagged silhouettes as the flames spread. Men were running along its deck, some leaping into the water to escape the heat, others frozen at their guns even as their world burned. A third Japanese vessel, a barge packed low in the water, tried to swing away from the chaos and blundered into the path of the wounded patrol craft Danny had just mauled. There was a crunching impact, a long metallic screech, then the strange, slow-motion sight of both hulls locking together, twisting, and beginning to roll under their own combined weight and damage. For a heartbeat, Danny's chest filled with a fierce, disbelieving triumph. 3 enemy boats, all struck in the same wild, impossible melee, one large transport breaking its back, one freighter burning and settling, and that smaller barge and patrol craft tangle now listing badly as men scrambled over the tilting decks. Then his gun answered his pride with a bitter reminder of reality. The Orlicon's next burst died halfway through, the weapon coughing out a final string of shells before the patched casing gave a sharp, sickening crack. The recoil that followed felt wrong. The entire mount lurched sideways, the feed tray buckled, and the charging handle jammed solid. Smoke curled from the breach, carrying with it the acrid bite of scorched oil and metal. Danny's fingers moved by habit, slap, rack, check, but this time, Nothing gave. The gun's heart had finally broken. For a second he simply froze, the noise of battle receding under the rushing in his ears. The one thing that anchored him in this chaos, the machine he understood better than his own thoughts, was dead. Then a round tore through the air close enough that he felt its passage as a hot slap on his cheek, and instinct drove him to the only choice left: adapt or let everyone on that deck die. He threw open the mangled feed cover, fingers burning as they brushed over heated metal, and saw that the brass shim he had wedged in hours earlier had been twisted into a jagged splinter. The casing around it was split wide, as though a giant hand had squeezed it apart. The gun would never cycle properly again, not tonight. But the barrel, the firing mechanism, the basic skeleton, they were still there. Keep her pointed. He shouted toward Pierce, though he wasn't sure his voice carried over the engines. With clumsy haste, he dragged a fresh drum into position, not to lock it in as designed but to strip rounds from it by hand. Hooking his arm around the ruined mount for balance, he began to feed individual shells into the breech, working the charging handle with brute force to hammer each one home. It was insane using a 20mm automatic cannon like a slow-loading, temperamental rifle, but insane was better than silent. The first attempt misfired. The shell caught awkwardly, skewed by the twisted metal. He yanked it free, flung it overboard, and tried again. This time the round seeded with an ugly grinding sound. He jerked the handle, braced his shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The gun answered with a single, thunderous shot. He worked like that in a brutal rhythm. Load, force, fire, load, force, fire. Each single shot kicked the mount and sent pain lancing up his arms. Each spent casing ejected at an unpredictable angle, clanging off the deck or his boots. It was nothing like the smooth, chattering roar of a healthy automatic weapon, but from the enemy's point of view, the effect looked very different. The silhouette of a PT boat still spitting orange flashes from a stubborn gun that refused to go completely quiet. Psychology became as important as ballistic. Japanese gunners, already shaken by torpedo explosions and the sight of their own burning ships, hesitated each time Danny's improvised fire snapped at them. Some of his shots went wild, others, by sheer persistence, found flesh or metal. He saw a machine gun nest on the freighter's stern jerk suddenly, as a single 20mm round detonated close by, sending men sprawling. On another escort, a tracer burst near a gun shield made the crew flinch and duck, precious seconds when their aim shifted off the PT boat's fragile hull. The cost of those seconds became clear when a new threat arose. Off their starboard bow, the second surviving escort, a larger subchaser, swung in on an intercept course, guns already flashing. It had seen the carnage among the convoy and recognized the PT boat as the nerve center of the attack. At the same time, the far side American PT, the one that had been drawing fire, stumbled in its course, a gout of flame licking up from its midsection. Whether from a lucky hit or a splintered fuel line, it was suddenly clear that their sister boat was in serious trouble. "Skipper, she's hit," came a shout from the forward deck. For the first time that night, Pierce had a sliver of open water ahead, a narrow corridor through which he could push his battered boat and break contact, leaving the burning convoy and the crippled friendly PT behind. Engines still ran hot but functional. They had already sunk or crippled 3 enemy vessels. Fuel was low but not yet desperate. No one would have questioned in order to disengage. The safe choice, the reasonable choice, was laid out in front of him like a dim path in the dark. He did not take it. "We're not leaving them," Pierce said, quietly enough that only those nearest him heard it first. Then, louder, "Red, hold course toward that escort. We're going to make him look at us, not them." Red swore softly in the engine room but obeyed, feeding power back into the hungry V-12 engine. The PT boat surged toward the oncoming subchaser, a splinter of plywood hurling itself at steel. Danny, half blind from smoke and sweat, saw what was happening and felt equal parts dread and grim respect. The point of no return had arrived, and his commanding officer had chosen the path that might very well get them all killed. Every man on board understood the stakes. Turn away, and maybe they lived to fight again while the other PT burned alone in the dark. Charge in, and they might buy their comrades time to get damage under control, or limp away but at the cost of drawing the full weight of Japanese fire onto their already wounded hull. There was no guarantee that anyone would even know, later, what they had done or why. Danny's fear flared, hot and sharp. The rational part of him screamed to conserve what little they had left: ammunition, engine life, luck. The part of him that pictured Tommy in the mud, relying on supplies that might never come if convoys like this kept getting through, forced him to clamp his jaw and keep loading, one round at a time, With hands that shook despite every effort to steady them, he continued his mad, manual gunnery. As they closed, the sub-chasers' fire intensified. Water leapt in tall, white spears around the PT, bullets laced across their bow. A splinter of metal sliced open the shoulder of the man at the forward, 50 caliber, spinning him to the deck. Another sailor grabbed the smoking machine gun, knuckles white on the grips, refusing to let it fall silent. Pierce jinked the boat in erratic zigzags, trying to throw off the enemy's aim without ruining Danny's line of sight. At 300 yards, Danny's single-shot barrage began to tell. He walked his rounds up the sub-chaser's superstructure, searching for soft spots, bridge windows, exposed gunners, anything that might make a difference. One shell punched into the base of the mast. Another detonated near the bridge, momentarily blotting out silhouettes behind a splash of sparks. Through gaps in the smoke, he glimpsed men ducking, gestures of confusion. The enemy's own fire slackened by the barest fraction, but in a duel where fractions meant survival, it was enough. Behind them, the stricken American PT took the moment to claw away from the worst of the convoy's guns, limping along onto functioning engines. Flames still licked from her midsection, but figures could be seen working frantically with hoses and blankets, beating back the fire. The choice Pierce had made to stand and draw the Tiger's eyes had given that crew a sliver of a chance. The price came due when a near miss from the sub-chaser's main gun landed so close off their port bow that it tossed the PT sideways like a toy. The concussion slammed through the hull, rattling every bone in Danny's body. One of the Packard engines coughed, faltered, then roared back grudgingly. The deck under his boots shifted, his carefully balanced stance blown apart. The next shell he tried to load slipped from his scorched fingers and skittered away into the dark. He scrambled after it on hands and knees, splinters tearing his palms. Another round whined overhead, shearing away a chunk of the mast. Someone yelled his name. He ignored them, grabbed a different shell from the drum and slammed it in with so much force that he thought he might break the firing pin. He yanked the handle and fired impulsively, not even fully on target. The shot went wide, a useless flash in the night, but the fact that anything at all still spat back seemed to matter. In that battered, stumbling state, they reached the ragged edge of the engagement. The sub-chaser, itself now nursing multiple wounds from both PT boats, hesitated. One of the torpedoes fired earlier had missed its larger target and now streaked dangerously close to the escort's turning path, forcing a hurried evasive maneuver. For a moment, enemy gunners had to choose between keeping their aim on the PT or making sure their own ship didn't roll into the path of the unseen fish. In that heartbeat of divided attention, Pierce took his smoke, he ordered. A canister clattered over the side, then another, spewing thick, white clouds that billowed across the black water. Under that sudden curtain, Red swung the bow away, engines howling as he punched every last ounce of power he dared into the overheated machine. The PT boat bolted, skidding almost sideways as it scraped the edge of the engagement envelope. Danny fired 3 more single, ragged shots into the smoke, not because he expected to hit anything, but because he understood how fear worked. To the men on the sub-chaser, each flash inside that white wall suggested that the devil boat was still in there, still fighting, still too stubborn to die. By the time the smoke thinned enough to show the truth that the PT had already fled beyond effective range, the distance between hunter and hunted had widened just enough. The withdrawal was not a glorious dash into the sunrise. It was a long, shuddering crawl. One engine temperatures danced in the red, threatening seizure. Fuel gauges sagged toward empty. The injured groaned on the deck, tended by shipmates who had no real medical training beyond basic first aid. Silence settled over the boat, broken only by the mechanical racket of men refusing to let their vessel quit. Only when the horizon began to pale did the reality of their survival sink in. The eastern sky bled from black to bruised purple, then to the first faint hints of orange. In that weak light, the PT's wounds came into stark, undeniable view. The deck was peppered with splintered holes, some only inches from where men had stood in the night. A jagged tear ran along a section of the gunwale where a shell had glanced off instead of cutting clean through. The Orlicon's mount looked like the skeleton of some burned metal animal, twisted and blackened. The tape and wire of Danny's patch charred into scraps. He sank down beside it, suddenly aware of the way his hands trembled uncontrollably. His fingers were blistered from hot metal and bruised from forcing mechanisms not made for such abuse. Black grime coated his nails and palms, and beneath it, his skin was an unhealthy pallor. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to truly feel the weight of what had almost happened. Pierce made a slow walk of the boat, taking stock. 2 men were wounded badly enough to warrant immediate evacuation once they reached friendly waters. Everyone else carried some market cut, a bruise, a shallow graze that proved how close steel had come. They had, by any rational accounting, been inside the margin of death for most of the night. No one cheered. There were exhausted smiles, murmured curses, a few shaky laughs when someone pointed to a bullet hole that had punched through a coffee mug instead of the skull, but the mood was too thin, too stretched. The sea behind them still burned in spots, low pillars of smoke marking where ships were dying. Out there, men were in the water, enemy sailors clinging to debris, calling out in languages Danny understood only as sounds of fear. Some PT crews, on other nights, had been ordered to pick up survivors when it was safe, and some had done so on their own. Tonight, battered and low on everything, they could only watch those distant shapes until the curvature of the earth took them away. Back at the forward base, the reception was brisk, almost perfunctory. Officers and signalmen crowded the pier, more interested at first in the damage reports and ammunition expenditure logs than in the hollow-eyed men stepping off the boat. Mechanics swarmed the hull with measuring tapes and clipboards, muttering about repair times and spare parts. A corpsman hustled the worst-take crewman toward a makeshift infirmary. The smell of frying food from the galley mingled bizarrely with the lingering stench of burnt cordite and gasoline on their clothes. A junior officer from the staff appeared with a clipboard and a tight expression, firing questions at Pierce. Time of engagement, estimated tonnage sunk, number and type of enemy ships observed, ammunition expended, mechanical failures encountered, each category a blank to be filled, each blank a reduction of the night's chaos into neat numbers. Danny, listening from a few yards away, felt a flicker of unreasonable anger. There was no space on that form for the way it felt to load shells by hand into a dying gun, no column for number of times I thought I'd never see daylight again. Still, as reports filtered upward and other PT crews brought in their own fragments of the story, a picture emerged. The convoy had been mauled. At least 3 vessels, 1 major transport, 1 freighter, and a smaller craft were confirmed either sunk or so crippled they would never complete their mission. Shore watchers and reconnaissance would later confirm that Japanese forces on that part of the front experienced unexpected shortages in the days that followed. Fuel caches not replenished, artillery shells rationed, reinforcements delayed or diverted. On paper, the patrol was a success. The official commendation that eventually followed reflected that. Months later, in a dry, mimeographed citation, the Navy praised extraordinary heroism and intrepidity in action against enemy forces, cited tonnage sunk, and noted that the PT boat had pressed home its attack in the face of intense enemy fire, contributing materially to the disruption of hostile supply lines. Danny's name appeared deep in the text, one among others, attached to a phrase about skillful operation of weapons under adverse conditions. It was not wrong, it was just incomplete. The war rolled on, more convoys sailed, some found by PTS and submarines, others not. More men died in the surf and in the jungle. Danny survived the rest of his tour by a mixture of experience and luck. He patched more engines, coaxed more Baki weapons into brief periods of cooperation, rode out more nights in seas that felt determined to claim him. Each patrol added another layer to the tightness in his chest, another set of images to the gallery behind his eyes. When his discharge papers finally came, they felt unreal in his hands. One morning he was stepping off a gangway into humid, diesel-scented air. A few weeks later he was back on the docks of Astoria, watching gulls wheel above quiet water. The Columbia looked smaller than he remembered, the swells gentler, the wind less cruel. For a time he drifted, taking odd jobs in the shipyard again, trying to fit back into a world where the loudest sounds were hammer blows on steel and the shrieks of saws through planks. Maria met him at the station, just as she had promised, but their first embrace was awkward, as if each were hugging a stranger who wore a familiar face. He did not tell her, not at first, about the night everyone had written his patrol off as already dead, or about the way his hands sometimes clenched into ghostly firing grips when a truck backfired nearby. She did not press. They learned each other again slowly, over shared meals and quiet walks, filling the spaces between his stories with the ordinary details of a life that no longer had room for torpedoes and tracers. Years slid by. The war's big headlines receded into history books and anniversary specials. Popular memory clung to certain images, flag-raising, famous battles, charismatic leaders, while the smaller, stranger episodes faded. One day, long after the guns had fallen silent, Danny found himself in a regional maritime museum with his 10-year-old son, sheltering from a rain squall. They wandered past displays of fishing gear and old photographs until a familiar silhouette caught his eye, the sharp, low lines of a PT boat, captured in a black and white photograph blown up larger than life. The caption beneath it was brief. It mentioned the boat's squadron, the general theater of operations, a list of the roles such craft had played: torpedo attacks, scouting, harassment of enemy shipping. Somewhere near the bottom, in smaller type, there was a note about a particular patrol in late 1944 that had inflicted heavy losses on an enemy convoy under extremely hazardous conditions. No names, no dates more precise than a month and a year. His son read it aloud, stumbling a little over hazardous. Then he looked up at the photo, at the tiny figures on the deck. One of them crouched behind a rear-mounted gun. "Were you ever on one like that?" the boy asked. Danny stared at the image for a long time. He could not be sure it was his boat. The hull number was just out of frame. But the angle of the photograph, the way the spray arced off the bow, even the way the gunner's shoulders hunched against the winded all tugged at something deep inside him. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I was. Were you scared?" His son asked, with the blunt curiosity of a child who has only seen war in movies. He considered lying, telling some easy story about how it was all excitement and heroics. Instead, he thought of the cracked feed casing under his palms, the feel of single rounds being shoved into a mechanism on the verge of tearing itself apart, the knowledge that at any moment that broken machine might be all that stood between his friends and death. He thought of the convoy's burning ships, of nameless men in the water, of the silence on deck when it was finally over. "Sometimes," he answered at last, "sometimes more than I can explain." His son frowned, not quite understanding, then reached out and slipped his small hand into Danny's. They stood that way for a while, side by side in front of the photograph. Two generations bound together by an image that hid almost everything and yet somehow contained enough. Others would come through that museum in the years ahead, glancing at the same exhibits, maybe pausing at the PT boat picture and reading the short caption before moving on. For them, the story would be a footnote in a long war, a curiosity about wooden boats and daring raids. They would not feel the phantom recoil in their shoulders, or smell burned fuel whenever it rained. They would not carry the label already dead in the back of their minds, the way those men had on that October night, even as they proved it wrong. But that is how memory often works. The grand arcs of history are kept alive by dates and monuments, while the smaller, sharper stories survive in fragments, family anecdotes, half-remembered patrol logs, a photograph on a museum wall, a man's brief hesitation before he answers a child's question. In those fragments lives the truth that wars are not only fought by famous names and big ships, but also by young mechanics with broken guns who decide, for a few terrible minutes in the dark, to keep loading and firing when every sane instinct tells them to stop. At the end of such a story, with the patrol over and the echoes still fading, comes a simple invitation. If this kind of lesser-known World War II story moved you, consider sharing it so that others can feel what it was like to stand on a shaking wooden deck in the dark, facing impossible odds with only a few men, a few machines, and the hope that their courage mattered. A like, a comment about where you're watching from or about relatives who served, a subscription so you don't miss the next untold story. These are small acts, but together they help keep alive the memory of those whose names rarely appear in the big headlines of history, yet whose choices, in dark hours, helped shape the world that followed.